Welcome to the UC MBA and Executive Education Masterclass series where we talk to thought leaders from both industry and academia. Today we have the privilege of talking to Roger Dennis, who helps leaders get above their strategy and look at the long-term view for the organization. He's worked with local and international companies like Sequent, Shell and Z Energy. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you.
What does that mean, helping leaders get above their strategy?
So often what I see when I work with leadership teams is that strategy is often formed by looking in the rearview mirror. So what happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and then take a straight line extrapolation of where that might go. And up until 2020, it was often very challenging to explain to leaders why they needed to think quite differently about the planning process. Interestingly, since 2020, because of the pandemic, a lot of that recognition around long-term planning has certainly shot up the agenda in many boardrooms.
What are these trends that you're observing?
I could spend hours on those. There are a number of really sort of macro scale trends which will affect almost every industry. And so if you think about the cascade between technology impacting jobs, impacting politics, and above all that, environmental degradation, including climate change, these are 4 very serious issues that many organisations are really finding it hard to grapple with.
Have you found that companies since the pandemic, keep looking in that long-term view and still have that long-term view?
That's a great question, because what I saw during the pandemic, probably in the first 12 to 18 months, was many leaders would say, the pandemic's here, we didn't expect it, what else is coming? And really stretching their thinking around going over the horizon. And now what I'm seeing is that elasticity of thinking is now going right back into business as normal. Let's just carry on, we're past that crisis, we're into normal again, whatever normal is. But it discounts some of the complex system interactions that are happening between technology, jobs, politics and changes to the environment, to the point that lessons are being lost right now about how to respond to unpredictable events.
Why is that? Why do we as humans try and return back to kind of prior status?
The challenge is that I don't think the human brain is actually set up to understand changes that go beyond immediate impact. And so if you think about the response to the pandemic, it was a near and present threat. You could see how it would impact yourself and your family in a very short time frame, and therefore organisations responded very quickly. If you look at climate change, it has been framed as an intergenerational challenge, and therefore it's much easier to discount that impact on yourself, because essentially our thought process is set up to think about immediate responses. What is starting to happen now in terms of environmental change is there's potentially a cascade of complex weather situations happening where unexpected events will start to pop out with increasing regularity. And the challenge for people is to think about how that impacts them and to get away from the sort of idea that we'll take climate change seriously when. Well, when is starting to come home this year and right now.
In other ways, shapes or forms than expected, I suppose, right?
Absolutely. So in New Zealand, at the start of the year, we had the flooding in Auckland, which has never really happened. You're seeing just astronomical changes in the ocean temperature in the Atlantic this year, which are literally off the charts. They had to redraw the chart to include the degree of change. And because we don't understand exactly how weather systems work, there will be unpredictable and quite significant changes occurring pretty soon, I think.
Do you have some stories, without being too specific about clients, some stories where these kind of tools and mindsets have been used before?
Yeah, so an example that will be very easily relatable by many people is a piece of work in 2015 where I led a small team and we spent 4 months analysing the impact of a global pandemic on supply chains. And this was really interesting because Ebola was breaking out in West Africa at the time, and I talked to a couple of clients and said, I think the primary issue isn't so much health, it is in the second and third level implications. And so we very quickly went right down to supply chains. this country and many countries around the world are in these long, spindly supply chains. And when disruption occurs to there, the on-flow effects just have dominoes that go right through all of society. And so we spent a long time on that, and then we went and talked to many corporate leaders and heads of government about this, and the collective response was, basically discounting the future. We've never had experience of a pandemic, and therefore we have no idea how to relate. We've sort of got this plan around how to deal with flus, and we might deal with that, but really this is sort of like science fiction, so thanks very much. And we found it quite an extraordinary reaction to what was clearly a very real threat.
How do you find leaders in New Zealand in particular? Because, that sounds to me like quite a reasonable response from leaders, just playing devil's advocate to be like, look, there are a million things that can go wrong in the world. Like, yes, we can map it all out, but hey, let's just put our heads down, do business as usual, and we'll deal with it when we need to deal with it.
So, and that's a reasonable question to ask. Yeah. And the value isn't so much in making plans, the value is in the process of planning. Because then what you find is you have difficult and challenging conversations around a particular series of events that may or may not happen, but those plans are really useful in other ways. So an example would be a piece of work I did with the healthcare system in Canterbury, where we looked at scenarios. We started this work in about 2007, scenarios which sort of involved three major issues. One was reduced infrastructure, because hospitals are super expensive to build and money's not falling out of the sky. We looked at increased demand on a health system, because the population in this region is ageing faster than the rest of the country, and an ageing population puts excessive demands on a health system. Also, an ageing population, double whammy, because you no longer have younger people coming into the system, so you have a decreased workforce. So we built scenarios roughly around the idea of decreased infrastructure, increased demand, decreased workforce. And that was part of the foundation for a large system-wide transformation. So there was about $1.3 billion and about 18,000 people in the health system in this region. And because we had thought about those scenarios and started to adapt the health system to those particular conditions, when the earthquakes hit in 2011, the system was already starting to adapt to quite different foundational situation. And what was really interesting about that was a couple of months after the quakes, on some key metrics, this health system outperformed other systems in the country which had not been affected. And the chief exec was regularly asked by people, how did you do that? And he said, well, we'd already been thinking about it, we just went faster. So the process of planning and thinking about scenarios meant that when an unexpected one happened, you already could adapt your playbook and move much faster.
So it sounds like it's much less about those scenarios than it is about changing mindsets and kind of skill sets of leaders.
Yeah, forecasting is often confused with foresight, and sort of trying to predict the future is folly. But really what you're trying to do is to get people to consider where they can mitigate risk or realise opportunity, and then how do they start to bake that into the strategic process so they're ready for unpredictable events.
You and I have spoken about this before, about that kind of strategy making piece and where this fits in that whole process, right? And this actually starts way ahead of that, doesn't it?
Yes, because really what you're trying to do with this process is get to the point where you're asking the right strategic questions. And what I see in so many organisations is strategy starts by assuming a known state. So everything's more or less fixed and we'll just tweak with the edges a little bit. And really what this process is trying to do is to get more coherent, more difficult, more challenging questions. And some of those questions may be easily answerable. Some of them may take some time to work through, up to months, and some may be unknowable. But really what you're trying to do is increase a level of robustness above the strategic planning process so that's better equipped to think about unexpected events.
And who's responsible for that? I mean, is that something that people like yourself come in to do, or do you kind of aim to teach leaders those boundary spanning mindsets?
The best organisations to work with are ones that are open to the process And I find that in many geographies, there's a certain size an organisation needs to be before they have someone doing it full time. In New Zealand, we don't have any organisations of that size. Possibly in Australia, there'd be one or two that I know of. But certainly internationally, there would be, a handful of organisations that have people full time doing what I do, and those organisations typically embrace that sort of thinking through their boards and through leadership teams as well, and it flows down through the organisation.
What is the implication for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, right? In terms of what is it that we can take home, or viewers can take home as leaders? What can they take as a practice into their businesses?
So one of the things you need to think about is how do you broaden where you get your knowledge from? How do you get away from people simply saying yes to everything all the time? And where do you find the most challenging conversations about the future of your industry or what your competitors are doing? And don't shy away from the discomfort that comes when someone potentially highlights something which may cause a significant threat to your organisation. Because the opposite of the threat is opportunity. So how do you actually turn that into something really interesting? So a client of mine in Auckland is Rush Digital, and they produce a range of different solutions for organisations wanting to get ahead of competitors in terms of the digital space. And so when I got to, I'd say, late February 2020, and I was sitting down with Rush, we started looking at how would you have a digital response to the pandemic so you can manage it much better. And that turned into the COVID Tracer app. And so for them, where they were looking at how you can use digital in normal environments for customer interactions, all of a sudden the environment changed and they were able to actually realise quite a significant opportunity out of a major threat. And so that that tool generated quite a significant revenue for Rush, gave them international exposure, and then a whole bunch of other opportunities as well. So not all threats can be seen that way, but actually trying to get ahead of the curve has a potentially huge payoff.
And it sounds like it's going to take concerted effort because we surround ourselves with the people we like.
Yes.
And our echo chambers, our social media echo chambers and our news echo chambers echo what we think and say. And like you said, we just assume when we're making growth decisions for our organizations, we just assume that it's going to be more of the same next year, except we're going to change. Nobody else is going to change and nothing else is going to change, right?
Yes.
So how do we practically do that? It just sounds like I don't know what the next practical step is for that.
So what I do, I work with clients to sort of elevate the level of thinking in that regard. It is impractical for most organisations to have someone like me full time. But what I work with clients is how do you elevate that thinking in a way that is a systematic process. So you're not just coming in and talking about growing vegetables on Mars or whatever some futurists like to talk about, but actually thinking about issues and events and opportunities that might not otherwise come into a strategic planning radar, and then working that through in a systematic way so you're not flooding a leadership team with Bitcoin, EVs, NFTs, AI, etc. all the time, but you have a process for filtering. And when you have a process for filtering, you generally land on a single issue. And in my experience, most organisations can ingest one issue a year. And then you start to look at that in more detail and decide what does that mean for the strategy? What assumptions do you need to check? What experiments can you run? What questions should you ask before having a considered response, rather than just, we're going to do this, we'll do that, we'll do that, we'll do that.
Yes, all these multiple factors influencing us.
Yes.
Landing on one and sticking to that for a year and really deep diving. That's great advice, because I do think that the temptation is there to just try and build multiple futures on multiple driving changes, etc.
Yeah, and for some clients, I've seen that we go through the whole process and we get to the end of the 12-month cycle and the response of that is, we're okay with that, we don't want to do anything with it, we'll just keep a watching brief. And that's a good a response as we're actually going to run some experiments, we're going to ask some questions, we're going to run a small team on that for 3 months. Because discounting stuff is equally as good as exploring stuff.
And do you find that as leaders, we're okay with that? So we always want to, achieve things and make things work. Is that a kind of a culture change that you need to also build into the team, just being like, this is important work that you're doing, whether something happens from it or not?
Absolutely, because then what you're doing is you're almost building the muscle around having these difficult and challenging conversations. And so it's really interesting working with forward-thinking boards and leadership teams where you can see permission to have that challenging conversation happening all the time.
Yeah.
As opposed to some teams where they naturally look to a chief exec or a chair for the answer. Nobody has all the answers right now. To assume that is just pure folly. So how do you build the muscle in the leadership team so that you can have these challenging conversations, and how do you get above uncertainty and complexity to have a coherent response when the time is right?
It also sounds like it needs a concerted effort from the team to be a good team, a safe environment and a high trust environment.
Oh, absolutely. And in my experience, there's probably only a handful of really good teams in New Zealand at that level. There are lots of mediocre teams. Once you've seen a good team in action, it's very easy to spot substandard ones.
And how do we improve our teams if we're not there?
That's a very good question. It's probably sort of outside my wheelhouse. One of the things I try and do is stay within my capabilities, and building leadership teams is a different set of skills that good organisations know how to do really well. They have the right coaches, the right mentors, the right culture. Usually it's set by a chief exec and flows down. And sort of my litmus test for seeing a really good chief exec in action is if you're in a leadership team meeting and the chief exec walks in and the conversation doesn't skip a beat and nobody stops and turns around and defers or waits for royal approval from on high. The conversation just carries on. That's a good sign.
See, and I think sometimes companies don't take those brave steps in doing, some of this kind of future thinking, etc. Because once you open the bonnet to this problem or this potential, it also means that there might be a knock-on effect to other things that we need to all sort out as an organisation.
But that's ignorance is not going to make the problem disappear, right? And so, I come back to it time and time again. Have the difficult conversation, and having it is just as much value as doing something.
Yeah.
Because you start to think about, well, what if, or how would we, or what happens when, rather than being surprised.
Yeah.
So it's no use building the fire station after the fire started.
And I think you also spoke about showing people kind of the different experiences and the different futures. That kind of experiential futures is also something that you specialise in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a term experiential futures, which roughly translates into how do you get away from just handing someone the report and going, it's all in here, you should just read this. And then what happens is they go, oh, thank you very much, I'll just file that away.
Yes.
And never sees the light of day. And so one of the things I work with clients quite closely with is how do you bring the future to life in a way that resonates? And I've done this with many clients in different places around the world where there's quite a different reaction when you bring a part of the future to life because it resonates in a way that a written document won't. And it's fundamentally different about how you get scarce leadership attention, how you keep it, and then how you enable leaders to act on that.
Practically, you build these big spaces that physically show the potential futures or future that you might be working towards.
That is one approach. So for different clients, we've worked on taking 10,000 square foot venues, converting them into things like a corporate, cross between a corporate roadshow, mission document and an interactive museum. People come through in small groups and interact, and that scales out. And so then what you're doing is you're not telling people what to do, but you're illustrating a journey of change. Done that in large warehouses, done it in shipping containers, done it in virtual reality even, because in VR you can create entire worlds and transform a standard meeting room without having to work with a 10,000 square foot space. So it's very effective. Other methods include creating artifacts, so tangible artifacts, almost like talismans where people can hold it and touch it and then decode some of the messages by having something tangible as opposed to the report that's filed on the bookshelf you never look at.
Because I suppose that's the flip side of it, right? So you're working with these leadership teams. It's often quite senior teams in the organization. Sometimes you say, let's leave this trend, nothing to do. Other times you say, oh goodness, we're going to have to either experiment quickly and fail forward fast, or we're going to have to make a large scale change in the organization. And this is then part of those methods that you use to A, bring employees along, and B, capture that scarce leader time.
Yes, and so with the large scale sort of system change experiences, it's around how do you take everyone on the journey as well. But it really varies from client engagement to engagement as to what is the method that's going to create the most resonance and what's the right audience for that. So in some situations you can create artifacts that bring that to life, and then the client may say, well, actually I want 25 smaller versions of that to go out amongst, second tier leadership teams. And that is equally as effective as doing the 10,000 square foot installation.
So Roger, what are the tools that you use to help leaders get their heads into this space?
So one of the really interesting things that I do with clients is we run this annual process, as I talked about previously, and part of that process is I take leadership teams on field trips around the world. And so this is really fascinating because once you've done enough work to identify where the future is happening ahead of where it is locally, you can then pinpoint organisations, research groups, venture capitalists, researchers, etc., and go and visit them. And so there was one client, myself and two people from the leadership team, we did a trip. We did something like 8 cities in 10 days. And we were visiting one location in Scandinavia, and we'd found this small advanced research team that was working in this particular area and were well ahead of the rest of the field. And so we travelled in this cab to this nondescript industrial park, and we opened the door and then went inside, and then this guy came out and he had purple Crocs, yellow socks and green walk shorts on and some sort of death metal t-shirt. And I sat there with these two clients of mine just looking dead ahead, just thinking this could go one of two ways. And we went in and sat down, and basically from the get-go we just took notes after notes after notes. This person was just opening up to all the interesting insights, answered every question. We could have spent 2 or 3 hours. And we walked out of that meeting just so much more informed about potential futures, because there is no substitute for sitting across the table from someone who is hell-bent on destroying your business model, who doesn't care about your organisational strategy and is way ahead of where you think you might be. And what happened subsequently was that small team was acquired by one of the largest players in the world, and my client then had a direct input into the R&D team of one of the largest organisations working in that space in the world. So there are places around the world where the future is already happening. It's just unevenly distributed. By finding those locations and actually sitting down across the table from those people, you get just fascinating first-hand insights. I've done that with leadership teams, done that with an entire board of an organisation. And once again, it gets you away from the report that gets filed into first-hand insights, which are really hard to ignore.
Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights. And yes, it's so interesting listening to you and all the amazing things that you've done in the companies that you've worked with. And thank you for joining us here at GC.
You're welcome.